Oh, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, continuing our Miami series. This is part 9, and we have just concluded the climactic operation of Operation 40, which was the Bay of Pigs or Operation Zapata. And of course, it was a spectacular failure, and there are numerous reasons for that. We talked in episode 8 about the promises that were made to incoming President JFK from the CIA in conjunction with the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs, and how all those fell flat. None of them proved true. And in the aftermath, immediate aftermath, though Kennedy did uphold his air support before the operation began, when it started to go south, as he had said he would not do, he refused request for air support from the CIA, which, of course, the CIA and the military had gotten used to Eisenhower in those similar situations saying, okay. Kennedy did not say okay. And so it was very easy to leak and to blame Kennedy for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. And publicly, he took responsibility. He stood in front of the press. He said, I am the responsible officer of government. Victory has 1,000 fathers. Defeat is an orphan. Privately, he made war against the CIA. He realized this is the second time I've been duped by the CIA. The generals and the Joint Chiefs lied to me as well. They are in cahoots with the CIA in this whole thing. Can't trust them either. But at least they're under my thumb. I am Commander in Chief of the military, and CIA is a rogue elephant. They're doing things, um, lying right to my face when they give me briefings, and doing things violate their own intel to try to goad me into a foreign policy decision I don't want to make. And so he, in his war against the CIA, first thing he did was issue national security action memos 55, 56, 57, taking covert, large-scale military covert ops away from the CIA and putting them under the umbrella of the Joint Chiefs, which is under his umbrella. So now he's got jurisdiction, or at least he's got better jurisdiction than he had before. This infuriated the CIA, who had grown used to during the 50s having all kinds of latitude when it came to covert operations. He also cut the budget each more each succeeding year to the point where it would be cut by 20%. One-fifth of their budget would be cut by 1966. He fired the top 3 guys in the CIA, asked for their resignation. It was Alan Dulles, Richard Bissell, and General Cabell, Cabell, uh, and just generally began waging war just like he said he was going to. In the aftermath of the Pigs, he said, I wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. That's what he's doing. And the CIA is not going to take that lying down. Okay. They're going to regroup and they're going to have the last laugh, so to speak. Um, when I left off in episode 8, the the aftermath was what we were discussing was who got the blame publicly, the private war between the White House and the CIA, um, and what the Cubans, the brigade members, and then the Cuban population down in Miami, what they thought. And of course, their thinking was that because they're just being all their propaganda is straight from the CIA, so they're being told what the CIA version of events is, and so they blamed Kennedy as well. So you start to see a switch happen on both ends. First, on behalf of the intelligence community, the military, the Cubans, the mafia, all these conspirators that were anti-Castro are after Bay of Pigs are beginning to look with a jaundiced eye at the White House and at Kennedy with suspicion that he's not up to the task and that he is betraying their cause. And the passion, all the passion that they had built up over years against Castro is going to be uh, trained at him instead. Now, it's not going to happen immediately. It's going to take some time because there's going to be some other betrayals that come along. There's still hope because of what we're going to talk about today. Kennedy realizes He's in deep with some pretty powerful interests. So he's going to try to make amends and to keep them on his side as long as he can, while still trying to keep Khrushchev at bay and pacify Khrushchev, appease Khrushchev enough so that that problem goes away as well. So today, what we're going to talk about is that transition. What happens next as far as policy is concerned? What is the Kennedy response? Are they going to quit on the endeavor to overthrow Castro? Are they going to quit on Cuba? Or is there going to be another effort? Are they going to redouble down? And so we'll start here, and this will sort of answer the question. I'm going to put my face right in the middle, right under Castro. Um, the answer to that question, by the way, is that they double down. The Kennedy brothers, which it's hardly, they're hardly indistinguishable by this point because Kennedy came into office with all these trusted advisors, but by now, we're only 3, 4 months in. He's been burned by these trusted advisors. He doesn't trust a whole lot of people. His circle's going to get smaller, smaller. I mentioned the fact that there was a change on both ends. I neglected to say what the second change was. The first change was on how the Cubans viewed and all these conspirators viewed Kennedy. The second change is in Kennedy himself and how he viewed these so-called trusted advisors, these folks that came to him every morning with the intelligence briefing, CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the military, the Pentagon, all these generals, uh, all these folks that were supposed to be advising him, giving him good intel so he can make the best decision. He realizes they're really trying to coerce him. They're trying to manipulate him. They're lying to him. And so from Bay of Pigs on, Kennedy learns quickly that there are people around him that are not acting in our country's best interest. They're not acting in his administration's best interest. They're not acting in his best interest. They have an agenda, and it runs counter to what his agenda is. They want war. And Kennedy, increasingly, in his 3 years as president, becomes more and more of a peacemaker. And so they're at odds. The direction that Kennedy is going, the direction that all these other folks are going, they're diametrically opposed to one another. They're moving away from each other. And so his circle of trust is going to get smaller, 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 to the point where, and I mentioned this in episode 8. It's kind of a fortunate thing looking back, in an ironic twist. A year later, when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, if he had listened to all these people that were his advisors, we would have been at war with the Soviets, and it would have been a nuclear war. But by that point, he didn't trust them anymore, so he refused to listen to them. And it was him and Bobby, basically. So now, unfortunately, the seeds of the Cuban Missile Crisis are going to be sown in Kennedy's response to Bay Pigs. So it's kind of a knife has two edges on it. So he tells his brother, okay, we're going to double down on this, but instead of them being in charge, I'm putting you in charge. I'm putting my brother, my own flesh and blood, somebody I can trust, somebody who has skin in this administration's game. So he puts Bobby in charge. And pretty much for the rest of Kennedy's presidency, they will be haunted by the specter of Fidel Castro. Now, right now, it's the humiliation, it's the shame of having been bested by your neighbor to the south. And starting now, it's going to be, well, I've made all these promises. I made campaign promises to organized crime, or my dad did. I made promises to the CIA. I made promises to the Cubans, exiles. I've made all these promises, and I've got to make good on these. And 3 months into my administration, they're looking at me like, and there's a lot of questions in their eyes. I can see it. They have their doubts. So I'm going to have to do something to prove that I'm still about getting rid of Castro and overthrowing the government, Castro's government. So he and his brother Bobby will at this point double down on their efforts. This is going to change tactics. They're going to put other people in charge, and there's going to be more involvement, personal involvement, rather than taking the word of the CIA or the Pentagon or Joint Chiefs. They're going to be more intricately involved. But there's a tap dance to maintain because he's made promises to Khrushchev, and uh, somehow he's going to have to keep Khrushchev at bay, the Soviets, while simultaneously appeasing all the hardline forces here at home, because you don't want to be a promise breaker this early in your administration. And now, at some point, the priorities are going to change. The priorities are going to change from keeping these people here at home and all these folks I made promises to happy, or keeping the peace. And especially between two nuclear powers, and he's going to readjust those priorities at some point. Right now, he thinks he can continue to promise people at home something which is completely opposite what he's promising Khrushchev, Soviet Union. So he's got campaign promises to fulfill. So there's a New York Daily News headline: Kennedy takes the gloves off, and you can see the date, April 21, 1961. I'm circling it there with my cursor. That's 4 days after the Bay of Pigs. So I remember the Bay of Pigs date always because it's my birthday, April 17th. So 4 days after the Bay of Pigs, after this spectacular failure, after he's gone out and owned the failure publicly, after he's determined, sort of done his analysis of what went wrong, how it went wrong, who misadvised him, et cetera, et cetera. And he's now decided, and he's public about it. He's taking the gloves off. That's why you gotta have this. And so what we're going to talk about today in this episode is how he does that. What are the logistics involved? What is the process by which we decide to go forward in this new public policy? Because the former foreign policy inherited. So going forward from this point forward, it's going to be his. He's going to own it. So we are now moving into the Kennedy realm of our foreign policy with respect to Cuba. Give me a second here. I'm trying to plug in my laptop. I don't have the longest battery life. Just realized I forgot to plug it in. So just a second. Okay. So, and I have mentioned this, I don't know, probably 100 times in these series, but Operation 40, after the Bay of Pigs fails, he makes this promise to Khrushchev that we're no longer going to meddle in the affairs of Cuba. There's going to be no more invasions of Cuba, no more attempts to assassinate or overthrow Castro. We learned our lesson. We're licking our wounds, yada, yada, yada. And that's what he tells Khrushchev. But remember, he's got all these promises that he's made here at home. So all he does is rename it. Operation 40, which is Nixon's baby, now becomes Operation Mongoose, which is Kennedy's baby. So that's an easy way to distinguish between the two, even though they're the same. Operation 40 was Nixon when he was vice president. Operation Mongoose is Kennedy after Bay of Pigs. And so the operation continues. And here are, there's all kinds of documents that show these meetings are taking place that we're going to talk about, where they recalibrate everything, rename it, and it's full steam ahead, all operating. Again, this is the Miami series. So it's all operating on this JM Wave Station, formerly the Richmond Naval Air Station on the South Campus of Miami University, which I think is about 12 miles south of the northern campus. And they're going to run Operation Mongoose out of this base. So out of Miami. So this is the SGA, where the JFK at this meeting orders a reconstitution of Operation 40, and they just call it something else. And they create this special committee called the Special Group Augmented Committee. Here you see on the right a picture, an image of this document, minutes of the meeting creating the SGA, and one of the meetings anyway. And it was charged with all the same things Operation 40 had been charged with. I mean, the creation document for Operation 40, though technically it's a separate operation, we all know, practically speaking, it's the same. They might as well just cut and paste everything that created Operation 40 and what they were supposed to do into the document creating Operation Mongoose, because they're all doing the same thing: sabotage, subverting a government, uh, propaganda, on and on. The intent is to overthrow Castro's government. And you know, now this is, as I mentioned, this is now on Kennedy. You have, it's interesting from a psychological standpoint. When you inherit somebody else's plan, you're not vested in its success or failure necessarily because it wasn't your plan. So, in my line of business, when I was a coach, oftentimes when you got a new coaching job or a new coach came in, he would inherit the previous coach's players. And you do your best to make them successful, to make your program successful, but ultimately, you're not really judged, or it's not fair to judge you until you get your own players and you've developed them. I mean, if you inherit somebody else's seniors, you have a year with them, but with your incoming freshmen, you have 4 years with them. That's the theory anyway. And so it's hard to pass judgment on a new leader of an organization until he or she has had a chance to fully develop his or her personnel or his or her plans or his or her whatever. Uh, you just don't have the same vested interest when they're not your players, when they're somebody else. You see this a lot in college, especially, or pros, where it's more transactional. High school, you can cut some kids. It's not like you can go recruit a whole bunch of new ones. But in college, you can. And so oftentimes you'll see a mass exodus of the old and a bunch of new ones come in because the coach wants to bring in his guys. Well, he inherited this Operation 40 plan. He inherited Operation Zapata, Bay of Pigs. And ultimately, though he stood in front of the American public and took the blame for it, that was Nixon's baby. That was the CIA's baby. But now whatever happens going forward from this point is going to be on Kennedy. And so he doesn't like the fact that 3 months into his administration, he's been bested by this tin pot dictator 90 miles off the coast of Florida. He's humiliated. He had to stand there and take it like a man, and he did. But that doesn't mean he's going to like it or he's going to accept it. Remember, he's got promises to keep. So he and his brother doubled down on Operation 40. They rename it Operation Mongoose with the sole intent of trying to deceive Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, because Operation 40 is him breaking his promise that he made to Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev's not an idiot. And why I say that they're sowing the seeds of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because at some point Nikita Khrushchev's going to realize that Kennedy broke his promise. And according to his son, in his memoirs and in interviews later, his daddy put those missiles in Cuba because he knew another invasion was coming. So in order to help Cuba defend, the question's always been, why would Khrushchev do something so reckless, so dangerous, to needlessly provoke a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union by putting missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida? Now, according to Nikita Khrushchev's son, he did it because JFK broke his promise to his dad and was fully intending on continuing his harassment of Castro, continuing trying to overthrow Castro, continuing trying to plan and train for another invasion. So Castro went to Khrushchev and initially was not in support of missiles because, again, Castro said, hey, I already beat him once. I could beat him again. Khrushchev knew better. This time, Kennedy's going to be calling the shots, and Americans aren't going to, they're not going to take it as easy on you the second time. They're going to be fully invested this time. So we're going to put in some missiles to help defend your island because you are now our client state. We have a vested interest in you surviving so we can maintain this relationship. So Castro flipped and changed his mind, said, okay. So anyway, as I said, that's sowing the seeds for what's going to happen in 1962. But this SGA committee, which is chaired by Bobby, again, Bobby's now in charge, includes CIA Director Alan Dulles, who will end up resigning until the end of 61. So it'll be like August or September. So in the interim, he'll still, because he is the director of the CIA, he'll still be there. Now, he'll later be replaced by John McCone, who will be his replacement. Alexis Johnson from the State Department, McGeorge Bundy from the National Security Agency, Roswell Gilpatrick from the Department of Defense, and Generals Lyman Lemnitzer and General Maxwell Taylor from the Joint Chiefs. These are the two that he trusts to a degree. So you can see here I have listed what I just wrote, said to you. This is the roster of people involved. And you see operational reps are Mr. Harvey, William Harvey. We've talked a lot about William Harvey. So he's prominently involved in all things Operation Mongoose going forward. Of course, we know specifically he's put in charge of Task Force W, which is use any and all methods at your disposal to get rid of Castro. And of course, if you're serious about something, you'll put Harvey involved in that capacity because he's a serious operator. He's been involved in black operations forever. Although not officially members, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, is a peripheral member. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, they also attend meetings. And so then, as far as operational control, Bobby decides that General Edward Lansdale would run the operation out of Washington. And of course, this gives Lansdale the authority or the responsibility of naming who's going to be put in charge of the JM Wave Station, which we already know it's going to be Ted Shackley. The bases where they're going to run Operation Mongoose are going to operate out of the same Operation 40 S-Force bases, which the S-Force is already operational. That happened in 60. And so they're already training at these bases. To the left, you see a map where those red stars are. That's the approximate location of these bases. So offshore on either coast of Florida, on the right, the star is out. That's an island called Swan Island. And on the left, that's No Name Key. And right there at the bottom of the Florida Peninsula is the Everglades. So you have three bases, South Florida, and then the two stars in Louisiana on the north and south ends of Lake Pontchartrain. And that's where these bases. Now, that does not include Miami JM Wave. JM Wave is the headquarters of all this. It's not the training bases, but it's the headquarters. So essentially, you have 6 bases involved in Operation Mongoose. You have headquarters, Miami, JM Wave, and then you have the 5 training bases. And of course, if you remember, I've made a big point of this. The Everglades was the E. Howard Hunt base, and the No Name Key was the Frank Sturgis base. I just always want to remind people of those two people in particular because they will be, one of the reasons we learn about all this is because of the information that Santos Trafficante gives us years later after these two guys get arrested at Watergate in 72. And in the lead up to the legal proceedings against their clients, attorneys for Santos Trafficante, who happen to also represent some of these Watergate burglars, get the story from Santos, and it fleshes out what these guys, these covert operators from CIA have been involved in, going all the way back to 59 and 60. And in E. Howard Hunt's case, and even Frank Sturgis, it's even earlier than that. But for our purposes, we'll say 59, 60. Lansdale's first decision was to appoint Ted Shackley, head of the JM Wave Station. Talked about that in several videos leading up to this one. And Lansdale's second decision was to appoint William Harvey to head of Task Force W. And he charged Harvey with the job of, quote, organizing a broad range of activities that would help bring down Castro's government. Do what you do, William. That's essentially a blank slate, pretty much a blank slate. Lansdale's third, so his first decision was to put Ted Shackley in charge of Janeway. The second decision was William Harvey. His third decision is to bring into Operation Mongoose a group of CIA operatives with whom he has personal experience, having worked with them in the past in other covert operations, such as in Guatemala in 1954, when they overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz. And this roster includes, and these are names that if you're serious at all about researching JFK assassination, these names will be extremely familiar to you. David Atlee Phillips, who later becomes the Mexico station chief, head of the Western Hemisphere for the CIA. Specialty is disinformation, misinformation, creating cover stories. David Atlee Phillips, David Sanchez Morales, who is the CIA special assassin. He is their best assassin. William Rip Robertson, who was one of the trainers of the S-Force down in Clint Murchis's ranch in Mexico, and E. Howard Hunt, who I already mentioned. So we are recycling a lot of the same names, and we'll continue to recycle these names as we go forward into the plot against JFK, as we go forward into Watergate. It just a lot of these same names just get recycled over and over and over. By the way, these pictures here are Ted Shackley. I'm sorry, not Ted Shackley. This is President Jacobo Arbenz. I really wanted to explain these pictures, almost flew by him. This is right after the CIA succeeded in overthrowing him. He's being arrested and they're strip searching him. And this is the president of Guatemala being humiliated publicly with photos being taken of this. They did it to his wife too. They undressed him and they took photos and then they published these photos to complete the overthrow, complete the humiliation of Jacobo Arbenz. So that was that Guatemalan operation. And that was all on behalf of the fruit company, United Fruit. Okay, so Operation Mongoose is functioning as a partnership between the CIA and organized crime. We've already discussed that. We've talked about how, part of Operation Mongoose included William Harvey's Task Force W. It also included executive action. These Task Force W isn't specifically an assassination program, but it can be. It's a blank slate. You can do anything you want. Executive action is specifically an assassination program. And they recruit mafiosos, specifically out of Santos Traficante's family down in Florida, Cubans, to blend in. And this is when they give them poison pills and all these different wads of cash, et cetera, et cetera. And it's simultaneous to all of this, the rifle is taking place under William Harvey's direction. It's not using mafiosos, it's using some of the CIA's own people for a specific target here at home. So we've got a lot of things, a lot of balls in the air. William Harvey is essentially juggling all of them. And it's because the CIA cannot blend into Cuban society, and everything Operation Mongoose is intending to do means you got to get into Cuba. You're going to have to use paramilitaries that you train, that you arm, you finance. These are Cuban exiles that belong to Santos Traficante's crime family. So you're going to have to get permission from Santos Traficante and the other crime bosses to use mafioso's people, his foot soldiers. So that forced a partnership between the CIA and organized crime. And of course, that partnership was negotiated, it was handled by the liaison between these two entities, and that was John Urselli. And because of this marriage, the FBI had to be brought into it, because the FBI, simultaneous to all this activity, is on the direction of Attorney General Bobby Kennedy going after the mafia, trying to put them in jail. And so the FBI has to be brought into this arrangement to prevent investigations into certain people, into certain organized crime syndicates and or mafiosos which might compromise the operation. I liken it to if you have an informant, you're Chicago police, and you have this informant. He's guilty of all kinds of crimes himself, but you're turning a blind eye to those crimes so that he can report on bigger crimes. So you're essentially giving him a pass so he can help you complete the bigger picture. That's what uh, this marriage between the CIA and organized crime forced the FBI to do. Turn a blind eye to these people and go after the little fish instead of the big fish, because the big fish are helping in some national security purpose, helping the CIA carry out its task of trying to overthrow Castro. So this is why when you get into the assassination of JFK and you have the same players involved, you can't help. If you run an honest investigation, it ain't gonna take very long to realize that all these people have ties back to not just the CIA, but also the FBI and foreknowledge of everything that's happening. And they also have ties to organized crime and these Cubans. And so that's why they had to tie off the investigation at Lee Harvey Oswald because and tell the world that he had no connections to the mob, which is not true, which he had no connections to the CIA, which is not true, which he had no connections to the FBI, which is not true. He was an FBI informant. Which he had no connection to the Cuban exiles and the paramilitaries, which is not true. Marita Lorenz tells how she was at a base when he was there helping train with David Ferry. He had connections to all these people, but they had to tie it off to a lone nut because any investigation, honest investigation, is going to lead back to all those partners, which essentially means the U.S. government, and can't have that. So here are the partners involved in Operation Mongoose as we've laid it out so far. Obviously, you've got JFK representing the executive branch. He's the one that set this in motion, he and Bobby, right? And they chose, or Bobby chose, as the leader from Washington, Ed Lansdale. So that's representing the executive branch. Representing the Department of Justice is Bobby, who's running the whole thing, and the FBI, which is running cover for a bunch of these people so they don't interfere in this ongoing operation. Then you got the State Department. We showed you the roster of people. Alexis Johnson was at the first meeting, all the meetings. Dean Rusk was a periphery member. He's Secretary of State. The Department of Defense is involved. Roswell Gilpatrick was on that original roster. Robert McNamara was also. The National Security Council is represented by George Bundy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is represented by the generals, Lemnitzer and Taylor. The CIA is represented by Dulles, who then is replaced by McCone, but also Shackley and Harvey and David Atlee Phillips and David Morales, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Organized crime is represented by the grease between the two, the liaison, Johnny Rosselli, also Santos Trafficante, who it's his people that are being used as trained as the paramilitaries. Meyer Lansky's handling a lot of the financing. He's involved. And all these people, all these organized crime figures I just mentioned are all out of Miami. Ted Shackley and the CIA, he's running, and Harvey, they're running Jam Wave down in Miami. Then the Cuban exiles, Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Barker, James McCord, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, etc. I listed those names in particular. There's a whole bunch of them, okay, obviously. But I listed those five in particular because those are the five that in 72 get arrested at the Watergate. So just wanted you to be familiar with those names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 names there that get recycled yet again almost a decade later. So this is a government. You can see how JFK and his brother have doubled down. That's why he said no. Nothing will be spared in this attempt to get Castro. We're not quitting on this mission. We're doubling down on this mission. And then you get into some of the specifics of what Operation Mongoose is charged with. Obviously, raids against crops, sugar plantations, sabotage of roads, bridges, utility companies, transportation systems, etc., propaganda. All of this is within the purview of Operation Mongoose. Also within that purview is assassination. Remember, concurrent with this is Task Force W, which Harvey is running, and Harvey only knows really one means of getting things done. That's assassination. And executive action fits right in that. So you got poison pills, exploding pens, high power rifles, which is what the S Force is training to do. Remember, triangulation of fire, high power rifles with scopes, hitting a moving target from distance. That was the whole training. The S Force was receiving poison wetsuits, a cancer bioweapon. You know, by the time we get to 63, we find that there's a secret program in New Orleans, which Oswald is involved in, is to create a cancer bioweapon out of the polio vaccine, SV40, simian virus number 40, which is cancer, which they found in the polio vaccine, the kind that they took orally, the sugar cube, and it would sit dormant in a person's body for 30 years, and then it would activate. Not in every case, but it was sort of random how it chose to activate or not. But anyway, for 30 years, you'd have the cancer virus in your body. And of course, we gave that polio vaccine to 200 million Americans, and it was sexually transmitted. So if it was two parents and then they had a child, it passed down to the child. So it's really way more than 200 million. But the saving grace was it had a 30-year incubation period. So the government begins trying two things simultaneously. One, to find a vaccine to handle the impending cancer epidemic in the 80s, because it was given out in the 50s. Also, how to weaponize it. And instead of waiting 30 years for it to activate, can we activate this cancer virus, create a galloping cancer that will kill someone in 28 days? And we can use this as a tool of assassination. And it'll look to everybody like the person died of natural causes. That was the 63 Medical Manhattan Project, took place in New Orleans. Oswald went to Mexico City. Now, the story that we'll all get after the assassination, and this is courtesy of David Atlee Phillips, the misinformation, disinformation specialist, is that Oswald went to Mexico City to plan the assassination. He went to Mexico City, but it wasn't to plan the assassination. He went to Mexico City to make the drop of cancer bioweapon to the contact that was supposed to smuggle it into Cuba. And as is the case with all CIA ops, they always have a cover. So the cover for Oswald's trip to Mexico City becomes this trip to the embassies, meeting with Kostikov, the Soviet assassination specialist, trying to get visas and travel passports to flee after the assassination. And that's the story. CIA was desperate to keep from the American people any knowledge of any bioweapon. That was actually the bigger secret of the two. And it became easily or very convenient to create a cover story that Oswald was arranging the assassination a month or 2 months in advance, and that he was arranging his escape 2 months in advance. And that, boy, how incriminating will that look? Of course, the story falls apart afterwards, but doesn't change the fact that he did go to Mexico City. Now, that's an interesting story that never gets followed up. I never hear people talk about it. When I hear people talk about the Mexico City trip, it's always in the context of, well, the story fell apart, and thus he must not have gone to Mexico City after all. Or maybe he did, we just don't know why. No one pursues the cancer bioweapon angle. I've not seen very much research at all connecting the two. And but it's a huge piece of the Mexico City saga. Anyway, this is all part of Operation Mongoose. And of course, most of these things are failing spectacularly. In 62, this is when Khrushchev finds out he's been lied to. So to counteract this ongoing operation JFK is overseeing, it's clear. I think Khrushchev probably waited to see if this was a Kennedy thing or if this was his hardliners doing it behind his back. And by 62, realizes this is the real deal. This is coming from the White House. This is coming from Bobby and Jack. So he sends 40,000 soldiers to Cuba, 1,300 field pieces, 700 anti-aircraft guns, 350 tanks, and 150 jets to Cuba to deter another invasion. And of course, In addition to that, famously, he also sends nuclear tipped ballistic missiles. And this is the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, it's interesting that when the CIA sends that U-2 plane take pictures over Cuba and finds out that Khrushchev is putting these missiles in Cuba, they're delighted. Think about it from their perspective. They've been trying to cause a war between the United States and Cuba. Bay of Pigs didn't work, but no president can allow a foreign superpower to put missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida and not do something about it. So they're going to view this going forward as a do-over. The Joint Chiefs as well, all the generals, they're looking at this, rubbing their hands and pleading, oh my God, how could we get so lucky? How so quickly after this spectacular failure when everything went against us? Now he'll have to listen to us and do what we recommend, because this is a national security threat. An argument can be made, and I'm sure Kennedy made it, that Castro himself was not a national security threat. Bay of Pigs didn't warrant U.S. action. He wanted to keep it covert, and he's essentially blaming them for not handling their business. But now, this is information that's going to make it out. It's going to be leaked out. It's going to be, eventually there's going to be a confrontation at the United Nations between their ambassador, the Soviet ambassador, the American ambassador. The whole world's going to see these pictures. Kennedy cannot. It's one thing to tell the CIA no, tell the Joint Chiefs no, we're not going to launch air support to support these paramilitaries trying to invade Cuba and Bay of Pigs. But it's another thing to tell the American people, no, we're not going to do anything about nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles aimed at all our big cities 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They think they got him. They think they got him in a vice at this point. And if he listens to them, they will get their way. This is why I point back to the Bay of Pigs as being a seminal moment in the Kennedy president, both in terms of how he handled Cuban Missile Crisis and who he listened to, who his inner circle and his circle of trust became, but also to what happened 2 years later in Dallas. It had, like they say about a story having long legs. The Bay of Pigs story had long legs, and it had consequences for a lot of people, most notably John F. Kennedy. And so that's the transition after the Bay of Pigs fails to the new Operation Mongoose, which is setting the stage for the new confrontation in 1962 between the United States and the Soviets in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The 13 days in October when we came very, very close to nuclear war. And thankfully, history shows we had two leaders of two separate countries. The two belligerents, the United States and the Soviets, had two leaders for such a time as this that were resistant to the hardliners in both their governments. There were hardliners in the Soviet Union too, pushing Khrushchev for a confrontation, just like there were hardliners here pushing Kennedy. And these guys stood up to that. They're going to stand up to that and anger the hardliner elements in their own countries to the degree that within a year, both of them will be out of power. One will be dead by an assassin's bullet, and the other will be forced out and shamed basically as a traitor to his country as a result of what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, boy, some pretty big historical things happened on JFK's watch, even though he was only president for about 1,000 days, 3 years. My goodness, you're talking about some majorly important historical events that took place. And this is the youngest president we'd ever had. He was inexperienced. He came in not knowing what he didn't know, and he was believing everybody around him, but pretty quick. He was a quick learner. He was a quick study. All right, that's part 9 of the Miami series. And just to double down on the fact that this is all being run out of Miami. I didn't mention that, but I'm assuming you know that. Operation Mongoose, which is replacing 40, is being run out of JM Wave Station. You got the three bases in South Florida. You got the two in New Orleans. It's all been run by Lansdale out of Washington. Bobby, the flow of power was JFK, Bobby, Lansdale. And then you have Ted Shackley running the base in Miami. His right hand is William Harvey. Harvey brings in, and Shackley and Harvey bring in all these guys that worked with them before, like David Atlee Phillips and David Morales and E. Howard Hunt, et cetera, et cetera. It's all being run out of Miami. All being run out of Miami. So uh, that is the conclusion of episode 9. And until episode 10, I hope everybody has a great day and God bless. Thank you.